Well, as those of us who were just at church this morning were reminded, Mary said yes to the angel and conceived by the Holy Spirit. And Jesus, our brother and Lord, came into existence as a human being at that moment, began his incarnation as a human embryo. And his first herald on earth, of course, was John the fetus, who leapt for joy in his mother's womb at the appearance of his Savior. So we can hardly say that our tradition doesn't have something to say about all of these debates about the status of the embryo. In all of our theology of the incarnation, of course, we know that Jesus came upon the earth as a human being so he could assume every aspect of human existence, every aspect except sin, and enfold it into a new and eternal covenant with God. We would now irrevocably be his people, and he would be our God. And because God had stooped down to become man, we would be raised up and could become like God. And he took up existence as a new human embryo to sanctify each and every stage of developing human life. This means that any attempt to demean or destroy or exploit human beings at their embryonic stage is an attack upon us all and an attack upon Christ. There are times in the church's history, and I want to make a little digression on this, when that was not as clear and straightforward as it can be today. Because there were times in the church's history, quite frankly, when we didn't know very much biology. Didn't have anything much to do with bad philosophy or bad theology. It was just bad biology. And the biology of the Middle Ages, for example, at least in the West, was largely taken from Aristotle. And Aristotle had a problem. He knew that the male made a contribution to the development of new human life through the semen, and he had to figure out, how do you get from that, which certainly doesn't turn into a baby in men, how does that get to be a human being in the mother's womb? And he developed a theory about matter and form, that the formative influence comes from the man, and gradually over a period of time has to shape and form this raw material from the mother into a human being. And if that has to happen, then it has to have intermediate stages. And one implication of that, which people have noted in years since, talking about feminist theology, is that it means that we all start out male. It means that when a girl is born, something happened. Something mistaken, maybe. At least that was what the effect that some people drew. And so the rule of thumb was that God gave a soul, that this being was formed enough to get a soul, 40 days for men, and maybe more like 80 days for women, because it takes a little longer, it's a little harder to get them to be rational. Now, as a matter of fact, this is not only wrong, but entirely backwards, because now embryology tells us that at the very beginning, all embryos are basically female. As a matter of fact, during those first couple of days of development, when the genetic material is mixing together and beginning to get its act together to guide all the future human development, it's the genome of the egg, the female half, that keeps the metabolism running and keeps the regular operations going for survival while everything else gets figured out. So those first couple of days at least, we are running on our mother's genetic material, and then the mistakes are made, you see. So, but all of this, and if you look at the Catechism of the Council of Trent, when it talks about the incarnation of Jesus, it says that as soon as Mary said yes to the angel, we had a complete human being of a rational nature, the human being Jesus, who was joined, of course, to the person, the Son of God, and that was part of the miracle, that the fact that there was immediate ensoulment of Jesus was actually part of what was supernatural about this, because they were relying on Thomas Aquinas' theory that for the general run of the rest of us, ensoulment didn't take place until some days later. But in the 19th century, the need for making that kind of differentiation disappeared, because in 1825, the ovum was discovered. All of a sudden, there's an equal formative influence from the woman as well. And when those two formative influences meet and mix together and combine, you have this unique new being that is neither father nor mother. It's not part of either one. You have this event of conception that forms a quite new organism, begins to develop along that program immediately. And when the chromosome was discovered, we began to realize that this is the joining of 23 chromosomes from one and 23 from the other to make a new genetically distinctive organism. The need for all of these different stages of development became quite obsolete. And so in the 19th century, you see parallel developments in civil law and in church law. Canon law started to drop its distinction between early and late abortion in canon law. But all of these theories about delayed ensoulment had never had any great effect on the fact the church was always against all abortions at every stage. It was always seen that even if this new being is not yet fully, does not have an immortal human soul yet, this is a being who is being formed by God in preparation to receive a soul. And you're disrupting the process by which God is helping you to bring a new human being, a new human person into the world. So it was never that the church said, oh, in the first 40 days you can do what you want. It was in canon law, though, there was a grading of how serious, how grave an offense abortion was. At what point was it full-scale homicide, the killing of a formed human person? But in the 19th century, with these new biological findings, the church dropped those distinctions and said, well, from the very beginning, it's a new distinctive member of the human species. It is one of us and a member of the human species, a human nature, and therefore to be respected as a person. At the same time, the American medical profession, for example, which was almost entirely Protestant, was not Catholic at all, was calling for an updating in light of the biological facts, an updating of American civil laws to forbid abortion at every stage in our secular laws. So this is an instance where people are always throwing the Galileo case at the church. And so this is a case where the church was right in tune with the latest findings of biological science and taking account of them just as fast as the secular world was. In the 1970s or so, there was some new variations on all this. People were talking about the pre-embryo. The pre-embryo is what some people wanted to call the human embryo the first 14 days. And this, the idea was up until the 14th day, you've got this being that isn't really completely organized as an individual. You don't have differentiation into different kinds of cells, and you have a lot of, the cells are all kind of interchangeable. But at 14 days, you have what they call the primitive streak. You have this line appearing down the center of the embryo, which is going to be the basis for the later spinal cord. And of course, the top of it is going to be the basis for the brain. And the theory was, at that point, the embryo starts knowing sort of which way is up and down and which way is right and left. And at that point, you have an organized individual. And before that, you have something less. So you had some Catholic theologians seizing on this theory and making their own new theory of delayed ensoulment at 14 days based on that. There were two problems with that. One problem was that even in the 1970s, the evidence was very, very uncertain for making such a big deal out of the primitive streak. And in fact, some of the scientists freely admitted that the reason for insisting on this theory was not so much that the science demanded it, but that they wanted to find in morality and in public policy a clear dividing line that would enable them to experiment on any embryos that were before that point. So you had, once human in vitro fertilization was proved to be possible, the birth of Louise Brown in Great Britain in 1978, you had people looking for these things and seizing upon them to say that's going to be the easy dividing line is 14 days. The problem nowadays is even greater, because the latest embryology findings have thrown the whole pre-embryo theory into the sink. It doesn't work. As a matter of fact, some articles just in the last few months in very prestigious journals, one called Development, which is a journal of embryonic development, and the other Nature, which is the preeminent British science journal. And the new account is quite different, that the primitive streak is just an unfolding of decisions that were made at the very beginning of embryonic development. That as a matter of fact, the embryo's sort of orientation, knowing which way is up and which way is right and left, happens very early in development. And some of the latest findings are that axis of symmetry that tells the embryo how to organize itself is formed by the point where the sperm first meets the egg. That this point is always going to lie along that dividing line, and that this establishes almost at that instant a new organization for how that embryo is going to organize itself. And the idea that these cells, these early cells, are interchangeable also turns out to be wrong. In fact, from the very first moment when the embryo divides from one into two cells, those two cells have different destinies, have different uses, different functions in the development of the embryo. One of them is going to go toward largely making the embryo proper, all the cells and organs in future life, and the other is going to be dedicated towards making all the support structures needed for that embryo's survival, toward the placenta and the umbilical cord and all of these structures that are going to enable it to survive for the first 9 months. The differentiation of cells, and this ends up being very important for this whole stem cell controversy, begins immediately, but from the beginning, it's provisional, it's changeable. In other words, the cells, as the embryo divides, our bodies know, the cells in our bodies know what they are geared toward becoming, but they're capable of compensating and switching back again to something else if there's a need to maintain the survival of the embryo. In other words, if a 16-cell embryo loses one cell, you don't end up with a baby born without a hand or a leg. You end up with the other cells continuing to interact with each other and compensate and adjust to that damage so that all of the body parts can continue to develop. But that doesn't mean that they're all interchangeable to begin with. And even the National Institutes of Health now has recognized this. Their report that came out this summer on stem cell research, and the NIH, their scientists are all extremely in favor of destroying embryos for their stem cells, unfortunately. Even more unfortunately, they're all career appointees, so George Bush can't replace them. But they said that it's really misleading to say that the embryo in the first week of existence, when some people want to kill them for their stem cells that are in there, that they're just a ball of what they call pluripotent stem cells. Pluripotent just means a cell that could develop in any of a large number of different directions. You get a bunch of interchangeable stem cells, each of which could go in any one of a number of directions, if you kill the embryo and spread them out in a culture, because then you've broken down that organization. But when they're in the embryo, they know what they want to do. They are very much geared toward producing particular organs for the future body. Now we know that we are just like the embryo in that regard, because people used to think that our own cells, in terms of their specialization, are locked in stone, and that turns out not to be true. That's why cloning is a possibility, because if you take the nucleus from one of your own body cells, very specialized cell, that all it is a skin cell, and you put it into a new environment of an egg whose nucleus has been removed, that new environment can make all the genes in the nucleus of your body cell switch on and become the basis for a new human being, a new embryo. So if having cells in your body that are not locked in and completely differentiated for all time makes you not an organized individual, then none of us are organized individuals. See? We're all just embryos, because with a little extra manipulation, even the specialization of our body cells can be reversed and redirected to make a whole new human being. So this has been an old, dusty argument of people who want to deny the humanity of the human embryo, is that because you can do twinning, because you can break off a cell and get that to become a whole new human embryo, the original embryo must not have been an individual. All they've succeeded in proving is that none of us are individuals either, because you can do that with a little extra tweaking. You can get a new embryo out of each cell in our body, and presumably that means that none of us were individuals to start with. It just means that the body, from embryo to adult, is this wonderfully versatile organism that can correct for, compensate for damage when some things are removed. That doesn't mean it wasn't an organized human being to begin with. But the reason why now, all of a sudden, scientists who should know better are reviving the whole theory of the pre-embryo, and we heard it in Senate hearing just a few days ago, because the Senate was calling forward the scientist Michael West, who wants to be able to make innumerable human embryos by cloning in order to kill them for their stem cells. The reason he wants to use cloning is that in this way he figures he can solve the problem of tissue rejection. We've had for a couple of years now this debate about embryonic stem cell research, that you can get these very versatile cells out of 1-week-old embryos and maybe in the future grow cells and tissues and even whole organs for people who have damage and disease of various kinds. This has never been done. There is, at this point, no proof that there's ever going to be any human therapeutic benefit from embryonic stem cells. They've done a few little things in animals, most of which haven't worked very well. In fact, the main thing that happens to embryonic stem cells when you put them into an animal is that they form tumors, because they keep going in all directions. And that's what a tumor is. It's something that's uncontrolled growth in all directions without organization. So they're actually too dangerous for anybody to have tried putting them into humans yet. But this is the theory, is that you could use these embryonic stem cells. But the problem remains that that's still going to be foreign tissue, because that embryo is not a genetic match to you. And so your immune system may well reject it. The idea behind cloning is that we take, if you have Parkinson's, we take a body cell from you, actually a whole bunch of body cells. I mean, this is such a violent and unnatural procedure that the wastage is enormous. I mean, we're talking about having to make and destroy 100 or 200 embryos to get maybe 1 or 2 that are going to survive long enough for you to kill them. Death is what it's all about here. So you take your body cell, take the nucleus out, put that into an egg, and stimulate it with an electric current to get the nucleus and the new surroundings, the egg cell, to interact with each other. This can produce a new human embryo who is your genetic twin brother or sister. And then they grow it for a week, and presumably stem cells will appear. Even this has not been done yet. Even the announcement by Michael West is that he got these new embryos to survive for a couple of days and then die, long before they would have developed these stem cells. But he wants to keep it going so he can get to that point. But then, if you kill that embryo for its stem cells, presumably these cells will be a complete match to the person who donated the nucleus, and you put those cells into this human being, and they will help them regrow nerve tissue or brain tissue. Again, highly speculative. We don't know that that's going to work at all. But the idea is that it would solve the problem of tissue rejection. Now, the problem with that is that, first of all, it means that in order to get cures and treatments for these various diseases, means that each of us will have to submit to having numerous new human embryos, our twin brothers or sisters, created and then killed for us to get these cells or tissues. There's also a lot of scientific problems with making this work at all. But now, various members of Congress, and especially in the Senate, who had committed themselves to the idea of embryonic stem cells moving forward to new cures and treatments, now find that there are all kinds of obstacles, including this immune problem, tissue rejection, and cloning is coming forward as the way to solve that. So we're willing to take that next step down the slippery slope. For the last 2 years, during the stem cell debate, so many members of Congress have said, you know, we're just doing this because this is from these spare embryos that were made by in vitro fertilization. They were sitting in the fertility clinics. They were left over. They were going to be discarded anyway. Why can't we just get some good out of them? Of course, we're not talking about creating embryos for research. That would be awful. And now they've gotten used to the idea, so they're willing to take the next step and say, but by the way, creating embryos by cloning just for research